I think I have Exeter to thank for, or to curse for my 30 years in Asia, 20 in Beijing and 4 in Taiwan. I found I had a knack for languages at the school and followed it for lack of any other interest. The book next to my photo was written a decade ago, and to my surprise, it became a hit among the financial set. I think I visited every hedge fund in New York when that came out. It was my 15 minutes of limited fame. But aside from Hank Sayer, nobody gets rich writing books. This picture you see is my wife's cousin, Dong Dong, holding my bike in the summer of 1979 in the front of the Forbidden City. You don't see any cars or modern clothing among the folks standing around. We both went to China in 1979. She had been there for 8 months in 1972 after Nixon's visit. I was a grad student. The next time after that, we stayed the longest from 1992 to 2011. So I worked for a couple of US banks. Our kids grew up there, we grew up there. It was really a terrific time for us as a family. We got to know Leslie's Chinese family very well. For work, I traveled almost everywhere in the country, discovering that my Chinese accent was better than 1.2 billion Chinese. I met most of the senior Chinese leadership at one time or another. They were very impressive folks, although they are retired now, unfortunately. My figure here suggests the path China has moved on since the beginning of what is known as the reform period in 79. The 1989-92 period was one you guys will all remember of great upheaval and rethinking. And from then on until 2009 and the outbreak of the global financial crisis, it was a very atypical period for the country. The Soviet Union had disappeared. The US economic and financial model seemed to offer a way forward. And after a multi-year debate, that is the path that was chosen. These were the 20 years we lived in Beijing, and they were really China's golden age. The current leader, Xi Jinping, might dispute that comment, but these were the years that China opened up to the world, its people, its cultures, and investment. This is the time that foreign workers of all kinds poured into China with their families. Entire communities were built to hold them. I was on the board of the International School, which in 2001 built a brand new $100 million campus for 2,500 kids. It was filled the first semester it was open. My wife introduced Halloween and Christmas to Beijing back in 1992, and it's now a major shopping holiday. My kids went to Chinese school and made Chinese friends. The place was what we all might call normal. Especially after joining the WTO in 2001, China simply boomed with annual growth, real annual growth over 10%. This is the foundation of today's China. Or put another way, modern China is only 20 years old. When we say China, what we're really talking about are these 4 provinces that I've sort of put in green. Together, their GDP equals that of Germany. This is no surprise, as these provinces have historically always been China's richest and their people the most commercial minded. The slides that follow enlarge on this comment. If you've gone to these areas, you will tend to think, this is China, and it's amazing. Well, these places are parts of China, but they are not China. The map also places a bit better known country with a similar GDP against each province. For example, Jiangsu, which is just above Shanghai there, has the GDP of Australia. Xinjiang, which is in the far, far west, has the GDP of Kazakhstan, which isn't much, and Tibet doesn't have a GDP. In general, once you penetrate beyond the provinces, between Hong Kong and Beijing on the East Coast, the level of modernization drops off quickly. In particular, the far west and Manchuria, which is the upper part of the chicken head there, there's homes to minorities that have never joined China's economic rise. And for that matter, the provinces in the Southeast are also home to minorities more similar to the people of Southeast Asia than they are to people in the North. This raises the point that the heart of the Han people lies in Central and East Coast China, but even so, there are people in the South and around Shanghai who fiercely look down on the bureaucrats in Beijing. Slide 5 here, and I only have 8 or 9. This slide shows foreign investment, which has averaged around 100 billion a year during this century, and has continued to do so despite the current unease. The red circles are scaled to show where the money went. These are the 3 big chunks. It is not surprising that foreign capital recognized the most commercial parts of the country. First and largest is the area opposite Hong Kong and Guangdong. Shanghai and Jiangsu, the province to its north, follow, and after these, the size of the circles rapidly shrink. I lived in Beijing for the whole time because banks need to operate with the close consent of the regulators and the Chinese leadership. As the box shows, $2 trillion was invested in China since 1993, 70% in these areas. It's no wonder that these economies and their peoples have prospered. And they're not just financially prosperous, but also educationally and worldly. The Chinese kids in our universities and Hank's classes come from these places. And Financial, the most innovative fintech country in China, and possibly the world, which is now being taken apart by Beijing, finds its home in Zhejiang, south of Shanghai. And Huawei, the Chinese company that is actually Northern Telecom, is down in Shenzhen across from Hong Kong. These are the places all the products we buy at Walmart and Costco come from. And these are the places that are part of the globalized economy and international culture with Chinese characteristics. These are also the places that all Chinese folks looking for paying jobs have gone to as well. This map is incredible. What I find most interesting is the huge number of internal migrants piling into Guangdong and Shenzhen down at the bottom. You can't miss it. This movement is obvious. There were lesser waves moving into Zhejiang and Jiangsu around Shanghai, and a small group from a very poor province, Hebei, moving into Beijing to build all those new buildings you see in the pictures. In 2009, after Lehman Brothers bankruptcy in New York, all the private factories in the Shenzhen-Guangzhou corridor shut down. That's the point of this chart up in the upper left-hand corner. You can see this big gap for 3 years. They all got on their 125cc Hondas with their families and went back home. You could see this on the nightly news. It was incredible. They all rode 125cc's back to Sichuan, which is where all these arrows originate. The private employment began again in 2012 and continued its rise versus the state sector. The state sector, despite all the money and funding and talent and everything else that it gets, contributes only 28% of the Chinese economy. From this map, you can see the engines of China's growth as well as the location of those wanting to participate. It does not include the entire country. Nothing from Manchuria, the far west and northwest. Not all Chinese are driven by the work ethic of modern capitalism. Here's my last map. So how do Chinese people think? This is the audience rating of China Central TV's New Year TV show. This is the Communist Party's annual blowout. CCT is built this thing in Beijing everybody calls the walking pants building. Thanks to Chinese TV, my kids learned to read books and to this day never look at television, although they sometimes stream. Each year on TV, CCTV puts on an extravaganza of what the party thinks is wonderful entertainment. It's a very high production quality, but you would find it extremely boring. This map shows the audience participation rates across the country. I've colored in those provinces in bright red that have viewer levels above 70%. Somewhat pink, those above 60%, and light pink in the high teens and 20s. The rest, all the southern provinces, are in shades of green, with Guangdong racking up a 5.3% viewer rate, second only to its neighbor, Guangxi, at 2.5. What's going on here? It seems the farther you go south from Beijing and the central television building, the less people watch the show. Put another way, the more developed a province is, the lower the audience participation rate. Nothing could better show the great disparities within China itself. If Hong Kong had this show, nobody would have watched. You all know what this is. It's just another take on the differences, however, between the different parts of China. The Great Wall of China is a failed foreign policy. Beijing's a great outdoor town, and my family loved to hike the wall, but not to the places where the tourists are bussed in. It's a long wall, so there are lots of places to go. And this is a shot of the wild wall we had just walked over to the northwest of the city. No one but foreigners hiked there. Hundreds of years ago, the kingdoms of northern China suffered nearly continuous incursions by non-Chinese tribes to the north and the west. Warding off these attacks was disruptive. Am I running out of time?
You got 5 more minutes.
Okay, no problem. Was disruptive and expensive, and a debate arose about how best to solve the problem. The Southern Chinese viewpoint was that all these tribes wanted was to trade. So just set up trading markets, paid them some money, and the attacks would be manageable. The Northern Chinese, who after all were bearing the brunt of the attacks, preferred to fence them out, and they won the argument. So these beautiful walls were built, but they were failures. As China was first invaded through the wall to the west, taken over by the Mongols in the Ming Dynasty, and created the Ming Dynasty, one of China's greatest. And then the Manchurians swept down from the east to a different part of the wall and established the Qing Dynasty, the one just before this century or last century. Maybe there is a lesson here about China. Another anonymous slide from some artist inside China attempts to show the great variety of political viewpoints. The vertical axis going from libertarian, there can't be many of those, to authoritarian, and horizontal from left to right. Of course, the apolitical center scores the most people, but there are a surprising number of Chinese who would fit the compartments above the horizontal lines from Trotskyists to the Falun Gongers. There are far, far fewer people below the line. During the golden age in China, political conversations were easy to have with your friends and relatives. It was a time when the Communist Party had backed off quite a bit from the lives of the people. There were no longer than the horrible neighborhood committees of old ladies sitting around paying attention to your business. You didn't have to worry about relatives, friends, or even your driver taking notes on your conversations and reporting back. Now this is all back, plus your friendly cell phone pal. One thing is certain, Chinese have a strong sense of nationalism, and this plus employment are the two pillars the party resorts to, now that its ideology has proven of little persuasive value. But is this enough to foster innovation? My last slide. Despite all the regional and political differences and indifferences, Chinese want to be modern. In winter 1979, I witnessed the first TV broadcast of any foreign TV show. It was a 15-minute tour of Disney World. Don't ask why. They just showed it mainly because it was cheap to acquire. And ever since, China has been pursuing the American way of life, if in a Chinese way. We need to look beyond the trivial picture of the country painted by the news and Washington to try to see the people and understand their views. In my experience, the situation always looks the most dire just before China comes to a rational solution. And on our side, we always tend to exaggerate those we think of as our enemies. We should remember that 2,000 plus years of history have shaped the Chinese view of their own country, as this character for country illustrates. The outer square there is the walls. The little square inside is the mouth, and the other things are an arm holding a sword, keeping the people inside the larger square in order. Many thanks, and I hope this has been interesting, and I hope we have a continued great series of TED Talks and a nice reunion. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. We have some time for questions if those of you would like to ask our expert on China. And you can ask in Mandarin or in English, either way.
I just spent time in Hong Kong recently when the protests were happening, and I filmed some there, and I talked about democracy. And it was very moving to see what the people actually felt. And yet in every audience that I spoke with, there were some people from the mafia or the police or whatever cracking down if they went too far. But this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
You're too kind. Thank you.
Yeah, Carl, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Hi, Rich.
How you doing, Carl? Two questions. One, the state of free speech, which you touched on in China as opposed to Hong Kong, and the point system that we read about that's being ascribed to each individual in China with respect to their abilities to move around the country, et cetera.
Right.
Can you comment on both those?
Yeah, so look, Hong Kong was part of the world. It was one of the great world cities before this unfortunate last year or so. And certainly there was free speech there. You felt, Hong Kong felt just like New York or like anywhere else in the country. It was not a problem. Of course, now it's a problem. And inside China itself, I wouldn't be talking to anybody freely like I used to unless I really trusted them. The social credit card you mentioned, I'm not sure how widespread it is, but they were trying to make it work. There's no question that the government or the party is using, forget the idea of government, there's no government there. There's only one institution, it's the party. And they are definitely trying to use the technology to control everybody. I mean, the system there is really an archaic one based on very much agriculture economy, where everybody could be held in place, and it was everybody was doing the same thing. This is not China anymore. Parts of China are still like that, as I suggested, but innovative parts of China that really create the GDP and move the country forward are not like that. So yeah, I'd be very careful there now. And when I've gone back, although I haven't been there for over a year now, you definitely don't talk to your driver anymore.
At what point do the Chinese make a play for Taiwan militarily, do you think?
Boy, that's really an awful idea. I think that if they do so, it's going to be result, even if we don't defend Taiwan, I think it will result in a greater loss to China than it will to anywhere else. I mean, I cannot imagine if China attacks and takes over Taiwan, which they probably would, that it would be possible for American companies to remain in China operating. And you have to remember that the real heart of the economies in the last 20 years has been the non-state sector. So I think the economy of China would be severely impacted.
Carl, in the early days you were in China, the inflow of foreign money must have been enormous. Is China self-financing now?
I took a slide out of here that gives you an idea of how China how the government finances itself. And what it shows is Chinese GDP against total banking assets. China is a credit economy. It's not based on capital markets. And what it shows is the total banking assets are 3.5 times the size of China's GDP. If you look back before the financial crisis broke out in 2009, then it was about 1.5 times. All during that period, from before 2009 until now, US banking assets have been approximately 1 times US GDP. So it gives you an idea how the government or how the party uses the banks to fiscally stimulate investment. And if you go through China, so the place is incredibly leveraged.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
I appreciated the talk. Before the pandemic, I read Carl's book, or rather I waded through it, having botched the opportunity to study economics at Princeton. So all I would say is I remember a tone of criticism for the Chinese banks, and I was about to ask a question about that, but I think it was just answered. Thank you very much.